Go. Okay, so welcome everyone. Let's get started. So today's theme is, as you can read, how to give a killer speech. Okay, so the level is C1, C2. Okay, so bear with us. So let's get started and I'll show you what we are going to talk about today. So we're going to start with how to structure a speech. Then we're going to move on to how to capture your audience and keep them engaged. And then we're going to look at some tips as to how to overcome stage fright. Okay. And then we'll summarize everything at the end. And as usual, we'll have a little Q&A session at the end. Okay. So let's start with a little bit of information. Okay. So I thought this was interesting, but 77% of the population has some level of fear of speaking. Okay. Now, the statistics show that actually it's a little higher. Women have a little higher fear of public speaking than men, and that only 10% of the population actually enjoys speaking in front of people. So if you want to know the actual name for the real name for actual fear of public speaking is called glossophobia. Okay. So that means that around 15 million people deal with glossophobia on a daily basis. Okay. And about 90% of people actually have some version of shyness when it comes to actually speaking in front of other people. So that brings us to the question why we're here today. Okay. So essentially it's to help you guys learn how to give a better speech. And this applies to, of course, presentations as well. Okay. So giving a compelling speech could actually be a very powerful tool. Okay. A good speech actually is able to resonate with an audience on a very profound level. So it's important to actually be able to communicate your message very clearly. So before we look at how to structure a speech, I want us to look at what makes a good communicator. Okay. So before a good speech, right, starts with a good communicator. So what do we need for that? There's a few different factors, okay? So one of the factors, the first one, is you've got to know your topic and your purpose. So before you go into any kind of a speech or a presentation, make sure you're clear on the topic, make sure you're clear on the message that you want to send. Next, you want to identify your audience, which there's an expression in English that says read the room. Okay. It's a way to say that you want to sense the vibe and you want to understand who your audience is. You want to have a game plan. You want something called active listening. Now, this is for a communicator and less about when you're giving a presentation, but active listening also has to do with the actual audience, okay? You want to speak clearly. You want to use appropriate body language, and we'll look at that in more detail. You want to be approachable, and you want to gain trust, okay? So all of these things we're going to look at in a little bit more detail further along. But before that, let's have a look, okay, at the actual steps to writing a killer speech. So there's essentially 5 steps, okay? Here you've got step 1, which we're calling the big picture, okay? What you want to remember when you're giving a killer speech is there's always these 3 cornerstones, right? You've got you, the speaker, you've got the subject, which is your message, and you have your audience. You need to constantly remember these three players, okay? Next, you want to think about the objective. So what we mean here is, what do you essentially want people to do when you're done with the speech? Okay? You want to be able to move people to a certain action. What's that action? Okay? Number 3 is quite an important step, and it's called the message. Okay? So when you think about the message, okay, don't confuse it with the objective. The message is what we would say in French, le fil rouge, okay? The red thread that runs through the entire presentation, okay? So through your entire presentation, you need to have one single unifying message. And you want to start with that message. You want to return to that. You want to support that message in the body. And you want to come back to that message in the conclusion, okay? Now, in a way to help you come up with this message often is when you're working on your speech, you need to think to yourself, if I have to narrow everything down, my entire presentation, my entire speech, if I had to narrow it down to one single sentence, what would that sentence be? Now, that's not so easy to do. But once you're able to narrow that down to one single sentence, then it becomes very clear what that fil rouge, what that message is. Okay? Next, we've got step 4, okay, which is relevance. Okay? So you want to make sure that the audience cares about your message. Okay? So you want, like as we say in French, it has to be pertinent. Okay, to them. Why is it relevant to them? Okay, make sure that you're putting the audience first. You're not there to just hear yourself speak. You're there to give them something that adds value. Step 5 is the structure, which we're going to look at in more detail. Okay, but here's a little tip. When you're working on your speech, right, you're going to start with an outline. Okay. A tip that is often used is start with writing the body of the speech and then go back and write your opening and the conclusion. Okay. So let's have a look at another key point in writing speeches. So as I mentioned before, you want to know your audience. Why is this important? So I'll explain. When you're giving a speech, okay, it's actually, you should consider it as a dynamic interaction, okay, between you and the audience, okay? And the audience is at the heart of this exchange. And if you want to captivate the audience, you want to keep them interested and connected to your speech, you have to recognize that every audience has they come from different backgrounds, they're diverse experiences, okay? So everyone has different expectations, they have different preferences, they have different cultural backgrounds. So it's not just important, but it's a strategy to help you tailor your speech to each audience, okay? Another important purpose is knowing your purpose. Another important point, is knowing your purpose. So this is imperative because it's really important to have a very clear understanding of what your goal is, what you aim to achieve, okay? Your core message is going to be the thing that anchors your speech and keeps everything focused, okay? So that you don't go off on one tangent or another. Okay, it helps keep the speech more impactful. It keeps your audience engaged and it keeps everything coherent and memorable. Okay, so actually, they did a study showed that 90% of presenters believed that a strong narrative in a presentation was critical to engagement for the audience. So a part of that would be to set objectives, establish relevance, like I mentioned earlier, articulate it into one concise sentence and emphasize the relevance and the value of your message throughout the speech. Okay? So let's have a more concrete look at the actual speech structure. So you're going to always have these three main parts. You're going to have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. Okay? We're going to look at each of these parts a little bit in a little more detail, but to give you sort of a macro view, what you want in the introduction is you want to capture your audience here. People's attention span are highest at the very beginning of a speech. So this is where you want to hook them and you want to get the audience interested in what you have to say. And what's important in the introduction is here, you have to state your purpose. You have to explain, you have to make it clear why they're there and what you want them to do at the end of the speech. Then you're going to move on to the body. Okay, so in the body, you're going to present some key points. You're going to provide some examples. You're going to give supporting evidence to what you have to say. And at this point, you want to maintain some smooth transitions. So transitions, and I'll talk about this in the next slide, transitions are actually a way to, when you're talking in a speech, to help your audience move from one part of the speech to another. So simple phrases like, now we're done talking about this, let's move on to this, helps your audience understand that they're moving to the next section. Finally, you're going to get to the conclusion, okay? And in the conclusion, what you're going to do is you're going to summarize the key points that you mentioned in the body. And what's important here is you want to try and create a link to the opening that you mentioned in your introduction. Okay, you want to circle back to that opening. It kind of brings the speech full circle. Okay, you want to give an impactful ending, and you want to end it with what we call a call to action, CTA, which means it's something that you want the audience to do when you're done. So depending on what that speech is, a call to action could be something big. It could be something small. It could be, as they say on YouTube, like and subscribe, right? That's a call to action. It could be, please donate money to this cause. It could simply be sign up to our website or go on our website and have a look. Or it could be click on this QR code and follow us, okay? Whatever it is, big or small, you want to make sure that there's a call to action at the end. So let's look in a little more detail, okay? Starting with the introduction, okay? Typically, there are three things that you can do in an introduction to hook people right away. And you'll notice that if you ever watch public speakers, they use typically one of these three. So the first one is using quotes, okay? Not just any quote. You want to use a quote that's thought-provoking, that's inspirational, that's very clever, okay? So I put an example here of one quote, okay? It's, in the words of Maya Angelou, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel, right? So right away, that's something thought-provoking. It evokes a kind of emotion, right? So this automatically will get an audience hooked. The second thing you can do is tell an anecdote, okay? So an anecdote is obviously, it's a compelling story. Okay. And it needs to be something personal, like a personal narrative, something that gives this human connection to you, the speaker. Okay. And this is actually very important because studies have been done that audience tend to connect better to stories than data. Okay. So, for example, I gave an example of one. So let's say you were telling someone a story of how you were going through a public speaking experience and you said something like, heart pounding, I stepped on stage, all eyes fixed on me as I felt my knees weaken and my voice waver. Okay? Something like that paints a very vivid picture of the emotions that you had when this happened, and it immediately brings the audience into your narrative. Okay? And what happens is people then they want to see, how did that story end? What happened? Okay? Finally, the third option is you can use a rhetorical question. Okay? So, for example, you want to stimulate some curiosity, right? You want to give this sort of dynamic that's interactive. Okay? So something like, what if a single speech had the potential to inspire change, ignite passions, and shape the course of history? Okay? Something like this. So, as a rule of thumb, okay, you want to try to make sure that your introduction makes up approximately 10% of your total presentation time. Okay? It's a little rule of thumb to help you guys. Next, let's move to the body. Okay? Here is where you're going to develop the message. Okay? So, a helpful tip for developing this message is, first, you want to gather and collect all your content together, okay? You want to write down all your ideas, okay, in a sort of brainstorming kind of way, okay? They don't need to be organized at this point, just sort of a free flow of ideas. Then what you're going to do is you're going to select the most important ideas, okay? Like I said, you don't want to have too much information or too little, so you're going to pick the most important details. Next, you're going to organize these ideas. So remember that the way you organize them depends on the type of ideas and the type of speech you have. So if you're telling a story that has to do with history, it's going to be in chronological order. If you're talking about a process or a business plan, it'll be in sequential order, like step 1, step 2, step 3. If you're talking about a climax, you're going to go from the least to the most important. A headline, for example, this year profits were up by 50%. You're going to start with that, the bottom line, the most important, and then give the details, okay? If you're giving a speech that has to do with the pros and cons, you're going to list the options, okay? Next, you're going to try to convince your viewers using data, charts, graphs, stories, quotes, sources, visuals, metaphors, demonstrations, whatever you need, but you want to try to support the information that you're giving, if you can, with something visual, okay? People like visuals. It helps them connect to the data, and it helps them understand the data faster, okay? What's important in the body here is you need to remember to signpost. And if you're asking yourself what a signpost is it's what I talked about earlier. A signpost is essentially a signal that tells people, okay, this is step 1. Let's next talk about step 2. Finally, let's move on to our conclusion, okay? This helps your audience follow along and know where they are in the speech, okay? Let's move on to the conclusion, okay? In the conclusion, you want to signal that you're coming to the end of the speech. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very important. You want to circle back to your opening. So if you asked a question in the opening, you want to provide an answer to that question in your conclusion. If you started with an anecdote and you told a story, you want to tell the end of that story in your conclusion. Or if you talked about a quote, You want to reiterate that quote and remind people about that quote. Okay? You're going to summarize the main points quickly. Okay? And you're going to repeat that single sentence. Remember when we talked about that purpose sentence in the beginning? You're going to repeat that sentence again so people remember why they were there. And then you're going to give the call to action. Okay? What do you want them to do? Subscribe to your webpage, follow you, invest money in your idea, so on and so forth. Okay? Now, some important points. Nonverbal communication. Okay? This is very important because a lot of messages come from nonverbal cues. Okay? So, very important, you want to keep a confident posture. Okay? Stand straight, shoulders back. Okay? This tells people that you're confident, that you're assured, that you're an authority when you're talking about what you're discussing. Okay? You want to use gestures to emphasize points. So use your hands, right? I use my hands a lot, but you want to keep it not distracting, just enough to make your point, but not too much to distract the audience. Okay? You want to maintain eye contact, but the appropriate amount of eye contact. Okay? You don't want to stare at one person for too long. Scan the room is a general rule. Keep a few seconds of eye contact with each member of the audience. Okay? What this helps is helps people connect, and it makes you more believable. Finally, you want to remember to smile, okay? Smiling while you're speaking communicates warmth and approachability, okay? And you want to avoid nervous habits. So all of us have nervous habits, okay? Some of us twirl our hair while we talk. Some of us play with our fingers, okay? Some of us bite our lip. You want to try to avoid these habits when you're giving a speech, okay? You want to keep a focus on your tone, your pitch, and your pace. So your tone is the emotional quality of your voice. Okay. So when I mean the emotional quality, I mean that if you listen to somebody's voice, it generally conveys like a feeling, right? So what feeling does this voice give you? Is it sad? Is it happy? Is it authoritative? Okay. So you want to make sure that the quality of your voice is in tune with your message. Your pitch. Okay, so pitch is how high or high-low your voice is, okay? You don't want to be too high, that tends to annoy people, and you don't want to be too low because that can be monotone. And the pace, you want to speak at the right pace, not too fast, not too slow, okay? So, a little reminder that the average audience, their attention span is only 8 to 10 minutes long. So you want to keep that in mind. So you want to make sure that you structure your speech with the most important information in those first 8 to 10 minutes. Okay? Generally, after 30 minutes, you have their attention up to 30 minutes, and after 30 minutes, it drops off immensely. Okay? So let's talk about how to capture your audience, okay? How to keep them engaged. So as I mentioned earlier, storytelling is very important, okay? You'll see this advice everywhere in giving presentations, in speeches, in pitches, okay? You want to make sure that you create vivid imagery. You want to establish like a compelling plot. You want to make it emotional, right? You'll notice that in the example I gave, we used a lot of rich adjectives, okay? And you want to use dialogues like quotes, okay, and a dynamic narrative, or talk about a conversation that you had with somebody. Okay. Like I said, storytelling is one of the most important things in actually keeping your audience interested in what you have to say. You want to try to keep audience interaction if you can. So what that means is, obviously, you're going to have a Q&A session at the end. So you want to ask people questions, like open-ended questions, okay? You want to try to get their thoughts, their opinions, their perspectives. If you can, you want to try to include interactive elements into your speech. So maybe you have a live demonstration, right? If you're pitching maybe a product, maybe you ask a question and you have a survey or a poll in the middle of your speech to kind of get the audience answering questions, okay? You want to use inclusive language. So things like, what do you think, right? When you say you, people automatically feel like you're talking directly to them, okay? And if you can, you want to obviously leverage technology, visual aids. So if you have slides, you want to make them interesting. If you have videos to include, use that. But remember, you want it to enhance the presentation, not distract people from your message. Okay? So, few tips about managing your anxiety. So obviously people always feel anxious when they're on stage talking in front of people. It's not an easy task, okay? So a couple of things you want to do to alleviate that stress is practice thoroughly and rehearse. The more you rehearse the speech, the more natural it sounds and the more comfortable you get delivering the speech. Next, it sounds silly, but you want to try to visualize the success of that speech. So imagine yourself on stage talking and everyone at the end is clapping and they're super happy and you're pleased with how you did, okay? So positive affirmations are important. You want to try to calm your nerves before you go on stage and take some deep breaths. So 3 long, deep breaths before you do anything actually immediately calms your nerves. You want to try to connect to the audience, right? So create a supportive environment. And if you can, right, you're always going to have some kind of a nervous energy. So if you can try to move that nervous energy into like passion or enthusiasm about what you're talking about, people will connect a little better. So, a couple of things to summarize. Remember these things. Be prepared, which means practice, rehearse, know your topic. Know your audience. You want to make sure that the message is tailored to the audience that you're talking to. Set your objective and your purpose, okay? Make sure you have that fil rouge, okay? That one message that kind of holds the entire speech together. Set your structure, tell a story, and at the end, be positive and passionate about what you're talking about, because if you're passionate about what you're talking about, people can actually feel that, right? They can feel that you're being authentic about the message that you're giving them. So, to conclude, you want to make sure that you have the right blend of words, the right tone, the right presence, okay? A good speaker, they can transform their ideas into something very memorable that stays with the actual audience, okay? The impact of a very good speech, it has the power to resonate with your audience. So it can actually change people's opinions. It can ignite their passions. It could instigate some positive action. So if you follow along with some of our advice here, you might actually become that small 10% of people that actually enjoy speaking in public. So we have some vocabulary as usual for you guys, okay? And as usual, we have some resources on the e-learning page about pitching, and some YouTube videos and some interesting articles about more tips about public speaking and some interesting statistics about the fear of public speaking. So I will take some questions if anyone has any. What do you guys think? Are you guys scared of speaking in public? Or is everyone here comfortable with it?
No, never comfortable.
Never comfortable?
No, mainly when it's in a foreign language.
So, and so yes, in a foreign language, it's even more complex.
Of course, yes.
So the key to that is in a foreign language, and I give this advice to my students all the time, it's even in your native language, right? It's already something that's a little bit uncomfortable and you have to practice it. So you have to double down on the practice when it's in a foreign language to make sure that you're comfortable using the terminology and the words that you're saying.
Yes, of course.
And I actually give this advice to my students often also. What's helpful, I think, in a foreign language is instead of writing an entire transcript of what you're going to say, I tell my students often to use bullet points. And in those bullet points, don't write full phrases, but write key words, like key words that you want to make sure that you hit and that you say, and bullet points in the order in which you want to say things. Those key words will kind of help you remember the phrase that you want to say, and the bullet points will help you keep an order in which you want to say them. Anyone else? Does anyone have any questions?
No, I think it was pretty clear.
Good.
Thank you.
I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you guys take some of that advice.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you. Yes. I'd like to speak and be as you.
Thank you.
Like you.
You will. Practice. Another piece of advice that I didn't necessarily talk about this is sometimes it helps, and I admit it's a little painful the first time you do it, but if you record yourself and you watch yourself, it helps because sometimes we have these nervous tics that we do that we don't realize that we do them until we see ourselves on camera. So it helps, and it helps to do the speech in front of other people, like in front of friends, and then they could kind of give you advice, like say, okay, be honest with me, and they'll give you some good advice like, this was good, this was not so good, try this, try that, okay? But you have to ask them to be honest.
How to lose friends.
That's the next conference. Okay, and so I think we'll have another 2 conferences planned for February. We haven't picked the topics yet, but they'll be up on the site soon. So hopefully we'll see you guys again in February. Okay?
Okay, of course.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye. Have a nice evening.
See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.